The day I left that house, it wasn't quiet. It wasn't discreet. It wasn't the kind of exit people make when they're trying to avoid attention. It happened in front of more than 100 people, on a warm afternoon in a suburban Ohio neighborhood, with folding chairs scattered across the lawn and the smell of grilled food still hanging in the air. I stood near the front door with my suitcase at my feet, waiting for a gap in the noise so I could say goodbye without making a scene. I didn't get one. My sister stepped forward before I could speak. She was smiling, the kind of smile people wear when they know they have an audience and intend to use it. She raised her voice just enough to carry across the yard and said, "Now our family can finally be at peace." The words landed hard. Conversations stalled. A few people laughed nervously, unsure if they were supposed to. Others looked away. No one challenged her. No one asked what she meant. My mother didn't miss a beat. She added, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "At least I won't have to serve a failure anymore." My father nodded beside her, arms crossed, and said, "Once you're out, you take care of your own life." Over 100 people stood there listening. Neighbors, relatives, family friends who had watched me grow up. I felt their eyes on me, waiting for a reaction, a denial, a breakdown. I didn't give them one. I stood there in silence, my hands steady, my face calm, and in that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I picked up my suitcase and walked past them. That was it. No speech, no explanation. Just the sound of my wheels on the concrete and the strange quiet that follows when someone expected a scene and didn't get one. By the time I reached my car, my heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. That declaration hadn't been spontaneous, it had been waiting. They had rehearsed my role for years, and that afternoon, they finally said it out loud. I was the problem, the burden, the reason peace had been impossible. As I drove away, I noticed the details I'd never paid attention to before. The way some people looked relieved, the way others looked uncomfortable but said nothing, the way my sister stayed where she was, basking in the attention, already confident she'd won. They all believed the same thing. That I was leaving because I had failed, that the family was better off without me, and I let them believe it. What none of them knew was how carefully that moment fit into a much longer story, one they had been telling for years without ever hearing my side, the version where I lived there because I couldn't manage on my own, where I stayed because I needed them, where my presence was a favor, not a fact. They didn't know what I knew. Not then. I drove straight to my apartment, a small place I'd secured quietly without asking anyone's opinion or permission. I carried my suitcase inside, set it by the door, and sat on the floor for a moment, letting the silence settle. No commentary, no judgment, just my own breathing. The words from the yard echoed in my head, not because they hurt, but because they clarified something that had been blurred for too long. They had declared peace. What they really meant was control. That night, my phone stayed quiet. No apologies, no follow-ups. No one checked to see if I'd made it safely. I wasn't surprised. They didn't see my leaving as a loss. They saw it as relief. And for once, I didn't rush to correct them. The next morning, I woke up early, made coffee, and sat at the small kitchen table by myself. The humiliation from the day before wasn't gone, but it had settled into something sharper. Understanding. That public announcement wasn't just about me leaving. It was about erasing me from the story they'd been telling everyone else. If I stayed silent now, that story would harden into fact. As I stared at the steam rising from my mug, another truth surfaced, one I had avoided naming for years. They could say those things so confidently because they believed the ground beneath them was solid, because they believed that house was theirs, that they had earned it, that I was lucky to have stayed as long as I did. They were wrong. I hadn't always known how to say that. For a long time, I didn't know if I was allowed to. But sitting there alone, replaying my sister's smile and my parents' certainty, I realized something else. Silence hadn't protected me. It had protected them. And I was done with that. I didn't feel angry, I didn't feel vengeful. I felt finished being misrepresented. Whatever came next wouldn't happen in the yard or in front of an audience. It wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be emotional, it would be deliberate. They thought peace had arrived the moment I walked out. They had no idea how temporary that feeling was about to be. After that afternoon, the words my sister had thrown into the air didn't stop echoing. They followed me into my apartment, into the quiet mornings, into the pauses between tasks. Not because they were clever, but because they fit a story people already believed. I knew exactly why no one questioned her. The version of me they had been fed for years made her announcement sound reasonable. That story only worked because of one thing my family never talked about. Not at barbecues, not with neighbors, not even in arguments behind closed doors. They acted as if it didn't exist, as if silence could erase ownership. Years earlier, long before that public declaration, that house had already decided our future. Back then, everyone admired it. A neat suburban place with a wide driveway, a fenced yard, and just enough space to make my parents feel like they'd finally made it. Neighbors complimented them on how well they'd done. My sister talked about it like it was already hers, like a kingdom she'd one day inherit. My parents accepted the praise easily, never correcting anyone, never explaining how we'd actually ended up there. The truth was simpler and far less flattering. The house belonged to my grandmother. She was my mother's mother, and she was nothing like the version of family my parents liked to perform in public. She was blunt, practical, and deeply suspicious of pretty stories that didn't line up with numbers. When she visited, she didn't gush over decor or comment on the yard. She opened the fridge. She looked at bills left on the counter. She asked questions that made my mother tense and defensive. She didn't hate my mother. She hated what my mother did with money. The impulsive spending. The way emergencies were always just around the corner but somehow never changed behavior. She had helped before, more than once. Loans disguised as kindness. Promises made with gratitude and forgotten with ease. When my parents moved us into her house, I was still young enough to focus on smaller things. Having my own room. Sidewalks where I could ride my bike. A backyard that felt safe. My sister adjusted immediately, claiming space, rearranging rooms, acting like it had always been meant for her. My parents adjusted too, hosting dinners, settling in, wearing the house like proof. My grandmother watched all of it quietly. She never said much while she was alive, but she paid attention. When she died, I was in my early 20s and still believed that being good meant staying quiet. The funeral was stiff and formal. My mother cried the way she always did when consequences threatened her comfort. I remember sitting there, numb, not yet understanding that grief and relief can exist in the same body. The meeting with the attorney happened a week later. My mother assumed it was routine. My sister came because she liked being present when things were handed out. I came because I didn't know I had a choice. The attorney didn't waste time. He slid a folder across the desk and explained that my grandmother had made her decisions years earlier. Everything had been documented carefully, intentionally. The house was left to me. Not split, not shared, fully. The air in the room changed instantly. My mother's expression flickered through confusion, anger, and then something carefully controlled. My sister's confidence didn't disappear, but it shifted into calculation. I sat there stunned, barely processing the words. Then came the condition. My parents and my sister could continue living in the house indefinitely. There was no deadline, no threat of eviction. As long as there was respect and responsibility, they could stay. Ownership, however, was mine, legally and completely. My grandmother hadn't trusted my mother with full control. She had seen too many patterns repeat. She had chosen structure over hope. I should have spoken up right then. I should have asserted myself, clarified expectations, drawn lines. Instead, I nodded. I signed where I was told. I went home to a house everyone still referred to as my parents. Within weeks, nothing looked different. My mother hosted gatherings like nothing had changed. My father talked about upgrades and repairs. My sister posted photos online as if the house were a reflection of her own success. No one mentioned the meeting, no one acknowledged the shift, and I let it happen. At the time, I told myself I was being kind, that I didn't want conflict, that everyone was grieving. What I didn't recognize was how quickly silence turns into permission. That afternoon in the yard, when my sister declared that peace had finally arrived, I saw the full shape of what I had allowed. They spoke with certainty because they believed they stood on solid ground. They didn't see borrowed space. They saw entitlement. Standing there later, replaying the past, I understood something that made my chest tighten. Every insult, every dismissal, every joke at my expense had been said from a place they thought was permanent. They believed I had no leverage, no authority, no claim. They had built their confidence on the assumption that I would never contradict them. By the time I finished tracing that thought, the confusion from the day before had settled into clarity. Their declaration of peace wasn't just cruel, it was ignorant. They had announced independence while standing on something that had never been theirs. And for the first time since that meeting years ago, I stopped seeing my silence as kindness. I saw it for what it really was. A mistake I was finally ready to correct. After the paperwork was signed and the meeting with the attorney faded into memory, nothing changed on the surface. That was the first lesson. Ownership doesn't announce itself. Power doesn't shift just because a document exists. In that house, everyone continued to act as if my parents were in charge, and I was simply still there, taking up space. They called it their home. They said it casually, confidently, in front of other people. Our place. Our house. When neighbors stopped by, my mother gave tours like she'd earned every wall with her own hands. My father talked about maintenance and upgrades as if he were the final authority. My sister referred to it online as the family home, the backdrop to her life. No one corrected them, especially not me. To anyone outside the family, the story was simple. I was the adult child who hadn't quite launched, still living at home, still figuring things out. Lucky to have parents willing to help. People said it right in front of me, smiling kindly, the way they do when they think they're being generous. "You're so fortunate your parents let you stay." My mother would nod, proud. My father would squeeze my shoulder like I was proof of their patience. I learned early that correcting that narrative only made things worse. The few times I tried to explain, my mother would sigh and say I was being sensitive. My sister would laugh and tell people I was dramatic. Eventually, I stopped trying. Silence became easier than being painted as ungrateful. It didn't take long for money to enter the picture, not all at once, never directly. It started with comments about rising bills, about how expensive everything was now, about how hard it was to keep things running. Then came the looks, the pauses, the expectation. I began contributing every month, framed as helping out. No lease, no agreement. Just an unspoken understanding that my presence came with a price. Utilities quietly ended up in my name because it was simpler. Internet, power, little things that added up. My mother promised she'd handle it eventually. She never did. If something was late or needed fixing, it was suddenly my responsibility. I told myself it was temporary, that it was fair, that it was easier than fighting. I paid on time every month for years, not because I had to, but because refusing felt like starting a war I wasn't ready for. Meanwhile, the house continued to be treated like a trophy. My parents hosted gatherings, ordered food, talked about renovations. My sister invited friends over and took photos like the space belonged to her. No one acknowledged my contributions. They were invisible, like everything else I did. The comments came just as steadily, about how late I slept, about how often I was home, about how I was always on my computer. Real work in their minds, had a uniform and a schedule they could brag about. Anything else was just killing time. They said it loudly, in front of guests, as jokes that always landed on me. The worst part wasn't the money or the chores. It was the way they talked about me as if I wasn't there, as if I were a long-term inconvenience they were gracious enough to tolerate. When decisions were made, I wasn't consulted. When plans were discussed, I was spoken over. I learned to make myself smaller without realizing I was doing it. There were moments that should have snapped me out of it. Like the time a neighbor thanked my parents for supporting me through a rough patch while I stood there holding groceries I'd paid for. Or when my sister joked that I'd probably never leave, because why would I give up a free ride? Everyone laughed. I smiled because not smiling would have made it worse. I told myself I was choosing peace, that this was the cost of avoiding conflict. What I didn't see yet was how useful that belief was to everyone else. The house became a stage, and I was part of the set. Something expected to be there, unnoticed unless it disrupted the scene. My parents' pride rested on how well they were doing, how generous they were. My sister's confidence rested on knowing she ranked above me. And my silence made all of it possible. At night, when the house was quiet, I sometimes thought about the meeting with the attorney, about the word owner and how it felt foreign in my mouth. I wondered if claiming it would actually change anything, or if it would only confirm what they already believed about me, that I was difficult, ungrateful, the problem. So I stayed quiet. I paid. I adapted. I shrank. Years passed like that, 1 month blending into the next. On the outside, nothing changed. On the inside, something hardened. I began to understand the pattern clearly. The more useful I was, the more invisible I became. The more I contributed, the less respect I received. By the time my sister stood in that yard years later and announced that peace had arrived, she wasn't inventing anything new. She was simply saying out loud what the house had taught everyone to believe. And standing there, suitcase in hand, I finally understood the truth I had avoided for too long. Silence hadn't kept the peace. It had been feeding the lie that I didn't matter. To my family, my life looked empty. I was always home, always in the same clothes, always sitting at my desk with my laptop open. In their minds, that image told them everything they needed to know. If I wasn't leaving the house at a set hour, if no one saw me come home exhausted, then I clearly wasn't doing anything that mattered. They said it out loud often enough. My mother waved a hand whenever I tried to explain what I did. Sitting at a computer all day isn't a real job. My father suggested I should look for something stable, something with benefits and a schedule he could understand. My sister took it further, joking to her friends that I was probably doing something sketchy online, the kind of comment wrapped in a laugh so she could deny it later. What they never bothered to learn was that my bedroom had quietly become my office. Not a hobby room, not a place to hide, a workspace where I built something piece by piece while they were busy deciding who I was allowed to be. My desk wasn't fancy, but it was organized. Deadlines taped to the wall. Client notes stacked neatly. Headphones that meant I was on a call, even if no one respected that boundary. For years, I worked as a freelancer, helping small businesses fix problems they didn't know how to name. I wrote copy that turned browsers into buyers. I rebuilt checkout flows that were bleeding customers. I helped brands clarify who they were and why anyone should care. I didn't do it for praise or exposure. I did it for contracts, invoices, and deposits that went into an account no one else had access to. I kept it quiet on purpose. Not because I was ashamed, but because explaining it always ended the same way. With disbelief, with dismissal. With my mother's voice rising just enough to remind me that whatever I was doing, it didn't count the way real work did. After a while, I stopped correcting anyone. Silence was easier than fighting for credibility in a house that had already decided I didn't deserve it. That silence came at a cost. I learned how to live small. I bought a mini fridge so no one could accuse me of eating their food. I did my laundry late at night to avoid comments about being in the way. I scheduled calls around family noise because asking for quiet only led to eye rolls. I skipped dinners where everyone talked over me anyway and ate alone instead. It wasn't isolation by accident. It was strategy. The less visible I was, the fewer opportunities they had to remind me where I ranked. The outside world didn't always make it easier. When I was dating someone seriously, the question came up eventually: why was I still living at home? I explained the situation carefully, tried to give context without oversharing. He listened politely, but I could see the doubt settle in. The story my family had been telling was simpler, and simplicity is convincing. He didn't want nuance. He wanted something he could explain to his friends without sounding uncomfortable. A few weeks later, he said he couldn't see a future with someone who hadn't launched yet. My family treated that breakup like confirmation. See? They implied without saying it. This is what happens when you don't get your life together. I nodded and absorbed it because arguing felt pointless. What none of them saw was that while they were busy diagnosing my failures, I was planning quietly, carefully. I wasn't stuck. I was positioning myself. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started with small decisions that felt insignificant at the time, tracking every dollar that came in, keeping my tax documents organized, raising my rates slowly instead of apologetically, building relationships with clients who respected my time and paid on schedule. I stopped thinking in terms of surviving the month and started thinking in terms of building stability. I separated my finances completely. Accounts no one else could access. Passwords no one could guess. Important documents stored where they couldn't disappear. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. I had seen how resentment behaved when it felt entitled to someone else's effort. I also stopped talking about my future out loud. No more casual mentions of plans. No hints about goals. My sister thrived on information she could twist, so I gave her nothing. My parents mistook my quiet for stagnation. They assumed that if nothing looked different, nothing was happening. That assumption worked in my favor. The apartment came later, after months of preparation. It wasn't big or impressive. Just a one-bedroom close enough to my work routines and far enough to feel like breathing after holding your breath too long. I didn't tell anyone I was looking. I didn't ask for advice. I didn't mention mortgages or paperwork. I handled it the same way I handled everything else, quietly, thoroughly. When I got the keys, I didn't celebrate. I sat on the floor of an empty room and listened to the silence. No commentary, no judgment. Just space that belonged to me. Back in my childhood home, nothing changed. My mother still commented on how often I was home. My father still asked when I planned to do something real. My sister still smirked whenever she walked past my door. They thought I was hiding from the world. In reality, I was building a way out. By the time they noticed anything was different, it was already too late to stop it. I stopped asking myself whether I would leave and started deciding how. That was the real shift. Not anger, not desperation, precision. I didn't want to storm out and prove them right. I wanted one clean move that didn't leave me vulnerable to their commentary or their rescue attempts. If I left in panic, I would end up back there. If I left prepared, I wouldn't need to explain myself to anyone. I gave myself a deadline and didn't share it with a soul. I built rules around it the way you build guardrails. No new debt, no favors, no dramatic gestures that could be used against me later. I tracked every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out. Freelance work can be unpredictable, so I planned for the months that would be quiet as carefully as the ones that were busy. I paid my taxes early. I organized contracts into folders. I treated my future like something that deserved structure. From the outside, nothing changed. I still lived in the same room. I still worked at the same desk. My mother still commented on how often I was home. My sister still rolled her eyes when she walked past my door. They mistook consistency for stagnation, and I let them. It was easier that way. The separation started quietly. Important papers went into a backpack I kept with me. Items I'd paid for were moved out little by little. A box here, a tote there. Books I loved most first. Winter coats rolled into trash bags and placed in the trunk of my car. I wasn't paranoid. I had learned what resentment can do when it gets bored and starts looking for leverage. When I finally secured my apartment, I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't a grand place, just clean, modest, and entirely mine. I signed the papers, took the keys, and sat alone on the floor for a while, letting the silence settle. It felt unfamiliar, like my nervous system didn't quite trust it yet. Still, I knew I was ready. The actual move happened the way everything else had. Quietly. I took carloads over several days, always when the house was empty. The desk I worked at, the chair my sister used to sit in just to mock me while I was on calls, the furniture I'd bought and maintained. I left behind anything that felt more like an argument than a possession. On the final day, I rented a small truck and waited until everyone was out. I loaded the last of it carefully, checking the room one final time. It looked smaller without my things. Less like a bedroom and more like proof that I'd been temporary in a place I had never truly been allowed to claim. I was almost done when my mother pulled into the driveway early. She got out of the car, took in the truck, and froze. Her face tightened in a way I recognized immediately. It was the look she wore when a story she'd been telling was about to fall apart. "What are you doing?" she asked, not curious, not concerned, accusatory, as if movement itself required permission. "I'm moving out," I said calmly, like I was stating the weather. My sister appeared in the doorway, phone already in her hand, eyes bright in that way they get when embarrassment feels imminent and entertainment feels possible. My father stood behind her, silent, arms crossed, watching like a judge waiting to hear an excuse. They didn't ask where I was going. They asked how. "With what money?" My sister laughed. My mother stared at me, waiting for the answer that would restore her sense of control. My father finally spoke, asking if someone was helping me, his tone heavy with suspicion. "I work," I said. "I've worked for years." The silence that followed was almost comical. My mother blinked, then scoffed. My sister tilted her head and said, "Sure you do." My father asked for proof, as if I were applying for approval. I didn't argue. I didn't show bank statements. I didn't explain contracts. I said one thing and meant it. "I'm done living here, and I'm done being treated like a burden." My mother immediately pivoted to how hard things would be now. The bills, the groceries, the way my leaving would affect everyone else. My sister muttered something about me being dramatic. My father said nothing at all. I closed the truck door, climbed into the driver's seat and pulled away. My hands were steady on the wheel. For the first time in years, the air felt like it belonged to me. I didn't block anyone. I didn't announce anything. I drove to my apartment, unloaded what I could, and sat on the floor again, surrounded by boxes that felt more like potential than clutter. My phone stayed quiet, and that silence confirmed what I already knew. They didn't see my leaving as a loss. They saw it as relief. That's when the narrative shifted, and not in my favor. I didn't hear about it directly at first. I didn't need to. I knew how this went. In their version, I hadn't moved on. I had given up. I had finally accepted what everyone else already knew. I let them have that story. I needed them comfortable, confident, certain that the problem had removed itself. Because timing mattered more than reaction, and I wasn't done yet. The morning after I left, I didn't wake up angry. I woke up clear. The kind of clarity that comes when something you've been bracing for finally happens, and your body realizes it survived. I made coffee in my small kitchen, sat at the table, and opened my laptop without rushing. There was no adrenaline left to burn. Just intention. For years, I had kept a folder no one knew about. Not hidden in a dramatic way, not locked behind passwords meant to scare anyone off. It simply existed because I understood even back then that silence without documentation is a gamble. The folder held copies of the deed, probate records, emails from the attorney who handled my grandmother's estate, and notes I'd made for myself when things didn't sit right. I hadn't built it to punish anyone. I'd built it because I didn't trust memory to stand up against entitlement. I printed everything, not to be theatrical, but because paper has a way of ending arguments that feelings never do. I spread the documents across the table and read through them once more, slowly, checking dates, language, signatures. Ownership, conditions, clarity. My grandmother had been thorough. She had anticipated exactly this kind of moment. Then I drafted the letter. I kept the language neutral, no accusations. No emotional explanations. Just facts. I stated that I was the legal owner of the property. I referenced the documentation supporting that claim. I explained that their continued occupancy had always been conditional, based on mutual respect and responsibility, and that moving forward, all communication regarding the house would be handled in writing. I gave them two options: sign a legitimate month-to-month lease at fair market rent, with utilities transferred into their own names by a clearly stated deadline, or submit a written plan to vacate within the legal notice period. No threats, no ultimatums, just choices. When I finished, I read it again and felt nothing dramatic. No fear, no guilt, just finality. I sent the letter by certified mail, signature required, and forwarded the same notice by email so there would be no confusion later. I closed my laptop, set my phone face down on the table, and took a sip of my coffee while it was still hot. The quiet felt earned. It didn't last. The first call came less than 10 minutes later. Then another. Then my phone started lighting up like something was wrong with it. Missed calls stacked on top of each other, text messages piling up faster than I could read them. Voicemails followed, some left only minutes apart. My mother's messages swung wildly between outrage and panic. "How could you do this to us? This is cruel. You know your father's health isn't good. Who is putting these ideas in your head? Family doesn't treat each other like this." My father's voicemails were colder. He demanded I come over immediately. He said I didn't understand what I was doing. He threatened to get a lawyer. He spoke like authority alone should be enough to reset the situation. My sister's messages surprised me the least. She wasn't scared at first. She was offended. "Okay, you made your point. Can you stop now? You're being so extra." When I didn't respond, her tone shifted. Voice notes followed, each one lighter than the last, that brittle laugh she used when she was losing control. It was just a joke. "Why are you like this?" Then my aunt stepped in, as she always did when things got uncomfortable. Her message was long and careful, full of words like gratitude and respect. She said my grandmother would be ashamed of me. That line almost made me smile. My grandmother was the reason I had any leverage at all. I listened to every voicemail once. I read every message once, then I replied with a single sentence. I attached a screenshot of the public humiliation they'd orchestrated when I left. My sister's declaration, my mother's comment, my father's agreement. I wrote, "You called me a burden in public. Now you can be independent in private." My mother called immediately. She was crying hard enough that her words came out broken. But even through the sobs, she tried to steer the conversation back to control. She said she didn't mean it like that. She blamed my sister for being dramatic. She worried about what people would say. She asked how she was supposed to pay for everything now. That was the moment it clicked fully. They weren't calling because they missed me. They were calling because the safety net they'd been bouncing on had finally learned how to stand up. "I gave you options," I said calmly. "Pick one." Then I ended the call. After that, I stopped engaging emotionally. Every message got the same response, if it got one at all. "Please refer to the notice. Please respond in writing. Please choose an option by the deadline provided." A few days later, the lease went out. Not handwritten, not improvised. A standard month-to-month agreement, clean and enforceable. The rent reflected the actual market, not a punishment, just reality. The utility transfer requirement was clearly listed with dates and providers spelled out. I sent it by email and certified mail again. The reply wasn't negotiation. It was disbelief disguised as outrage. My father texted that it was ridiculous and that parents don't pay their children rent. My mother wrote paragraphs about how greedy I was. My sister offered a fraction of the amount, as if she were doing me a favor. They still believed I would fold. They always had. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't about the house. It was about the moment they realized their authority only worked as long as I believed in it. The deadline passed without a signed lease, without utilities transferred, without a move-out plan. Just more messages, louder and more frantic than before. I didn't remind them again. I moved on to the next step, exactly as outlined. For the first time, their confidence wavered, and I didn't need to raise my voice to see it happen. The deadline came and went without ceremony. No signed lease, no written move-out plan, no utilities transferred. Just more messages that grew sharper as the reality set in. They weren't confused anymore. They were offended. In their minds, This was a negotiation they were entitled to win simply by refusing to accept the terms. My father texted first, his tone slipping back into authority like a habit he expected to still work. "This is ridiculous. We're not paying our own daughter rent." He wrote it like that sentence alone should end the discussion, like morality would override documentation if he stated it firmly enough. My mother followed with paragraphs, long, winding messages about everything she had done for me, every sacrifice she claimed she'd made. She called me greedy, ungrateful. She said I was punishing them for a joke. She avoided the word ownership completely, as if ignoring it would make it disappear. My sister tried a different approach. She messaged me privately, not about the house, but about herself. "People are asking questions. You're making me look bad. You need to stop being dramatic." Then, she offered a fraction of the rent, framed as a compromise. It was almost insulting how confident she was that I would take it. $400, like I was the one begging to stay. That's when I understood they still believed I would fold. That I always did. So, I stopped explaining. I didn't argue point by point. I didn't respond to emotional bait. I followed the plan exactly as written, because this was the part that didn't rely on their cooperation. I contacted the utility companies and scheduled the changes: electric, gas, internet. All the accounts that had quietly lived under my name for years because it was easier, because I was reliable, because no one else wanted the responsibility. I didn't hide the dates. I didn't spring anything on them. I executed what I had already stated in writing. The morning the shutoffs took effect, my phone exploded. My mother called screaming, her voice sharp with panic. She said the house was freezing, the stove wouldn't light. "Your father can't work without the internet. How could you do this to us?" She said I was ruining their lives, as if inconvenience were a personal attack instead of a consequence. My sister left a voice note that bounced between fury and disbelief. "This is insane. You're actually insane. You can't just do this." She sounded less confident now, like someone realizing the floor they'd been standing on wasn't solid after all. My father didn't yell. That scared me more. His voice was low, strained, unfamiliar. He asked me to turn it back on. Just for now. He said we could talk. We could figure it out. That word talk hit me like a joke. Talking was all we had done for years while nothing ever changed. I sent one message. The same one every time. "The accounts are in my name. I gave you the deadline to transfer them. You chose not to." There was a long pause after that. Then the scrambling began. They packed quickly, not carefully, suitcases dragged out, bags filled without order. Pride folded away, because there wasn't room for it anymore. They ran to my aunt's place, the same aunt who had lectured me about family loyalty days earlier. Suddenly, the people who had called me a burden were sleeping on someone else's couch. I didn't show up to watch. I didn't need to. I heard about it through the frantic messages they kept sending, the ones that grew quieter as the reality settled in. My aunt's house was cramped, temporary, uncomfortable. It didn't come with the illusion of control they'd grown used to. Online, the tone shifted too. My sister tried to regain the narrative with vague posts about betrayal and toxic people. Quotes about loyalty, about being misunderstood. They didn't land the way she expected. The comments were fewer. Some people asked what actually happened. When she snapped at them, they stopped engaging. My mother tried the victim route at work, borrowing money from a coworker to cover a bill that wasn't even in her name. When the pattern surfaced and questions were asked, her hours were cut. My father started talking about picking up gig work, anything quick, because the credit cards were already stretched thin, and now there was nowhere to hide. They kept telling each other this was temporary, that I would come to my senses, that family always caves. They said it like a rule they'd seen proven before. Maybe it would have worked on the version of me who paid rent to live in her own house and smiled through insults to keep the peace. But that version of me didn't exist anymore. By the time they started threatening legal action, the confidence behind it was gone. My father talked about judges and fairness and what a court would never allow. He spoke like the system ran on tradition and shame instead of paperwork. He didn't understand that the real world doesn't care how something looks. It cares about timelines and documentation. Everything that mattered was already in writing. When the court date came, they arrived dressed carefully, like appearances could still do some of the work. My mother wore that tight expression she used when she wanted sympathy from strangers. My sister scanned the room like she expected an audience. My father stood too close to me, like proximity alone could reassert authority. The judge didn't ask about feelings. The judge asked for documents. I handed them over calmly. Certified mail receipts. The notice. The lease they refused to sign. The utility deadlines. The screenshots of the public humiliation that made informal solutions impossible. The timeline spoke for itself. Their voices got louder, then quieter, then uncertain. My mother cried. My sister interrupted. My father tried to redirect. None of it mattered. The order came through, clean, procedural, final. Outside the courtroom, my mother grabbed my arm like she still had the right. Her nails dug into my sleeve as she told me I was ruining them. My sister hissed that I was evil. My father told me to be reasonable, as if reason hadn't already been exhausted. I gently removed my mother's hand and said one thing. I offered you options. You chose pride. Then I walked away. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, like someone who had finally put down a weight she didn't realize had been crushing her. They thought hardship would scare me back into my place. All it did was confirm why I left. By the time everything was over, it no longer felt personal. That surprised me the most. I had expected the end to come with either relief or grief, maybe both tangled together. Instead, what I felt was distance, the kind that comes when something finally moves out of your nervous system and into the past. The court didn't linger on drama. It never does. Documents were reviewed, timelines confirmed, ownership recognized. The judge didn't care about intentions or family roles or who felt betrayed. None of that mattered once the paperwork spoke clearly. When it was finished, there was no grand speech, no moral lesson delivered from the bench, just a conclusion that stood on process and fact. I walked out knowing I was legally right, but more importantly, emotionally done. For a few weeks afterward, I let things settle. I didn't rush to reclaim the house as a symbol or prove a point by moving back in. That place had never been peace for me, even when my name was on the deed. It carried too many echoes, too many years of shrinking to survive. Keeping it would have meant staying connected to a version of my life I had already outgrown. So I made the decision quietly. I sold it. People assumed that was the cruelest part, but it wasn't done out of anger. It was done out of clarity. Selling the house meant closing the last door that could be knocked on. No leverage, no lingering obligations, no excuse for contact disguised as necessity. The process was clean and professional, handled through an agent who didn't know the history and didn't need to. When the sale went through, I didn't throw a party. I sat at my kitchen table in my apartment, looked at the confirmation, and felt something in my chest finally unclench. With the proceeds, I did what my family never had. I planned. I invested back into my work. I upgraded equipment that made my days smoother instead of louder. I hired an accountant so my finances were airtight and boring in the best way. I built a buffer that meant I would never again feel trapped by one bad month or one unexpected expense. I also did something I hadn't expected. I started therapy. Not because I was broken, but because I didn't want to carry their voices forward with me. I didn't want to flinch every time I rested. I didn't want to question my worth every time I said no. Healing, I learned, isn't dramatic. It's repetitive. It's choosing yourself over the version of you that learned survival too early. My family moved on too, in their own way. A smaller apartment on the edge of town. No yard. No space to perform the version of success they'd sold to everyone else. My father took on work he used to mock. My mother told anyone who would listen that her daughter had abandoned her, carefully leaving out the part where she'd publicly declared that I was the problem. My sister tried to maintain her image online, but it didn't hit the same without the house behind her. People noticed. They always do, eventually. The most satisfying part wasn't watching them struggle. It was watching the world stop rewarding their cruelty. Friends who once laughed at their jokes grew quiet. Invitations slowed. Sympathy thinned. Not because anyone became a hero overnight, but because people instinctively step back from those who humiliate others for comfort. Even my ex reached out months later. The timing was almost insulting. A casual message. "Hope you're doing well. You handled everything so impressively. Translation was easy. Now that you look stable, I'm interested again." I blocked him without responding, and that small click felt like closing a door I should have shut years earlier. Every so often, I think back to that afternoon in the yard. My sister's smile, my parents' certainty, the way they announced peace as if it were something they could declare into existence. What they didn't understand then, and maybe never will, is that peace doesn't come from removing a person. It comes from removing the dynamic that made someone disposable. I don't feel guilty, I feel honest. I didn't want a war, I wanted a family. But love without respect is just control in a softer voice. And family isn't a free pass to humiliate you, use you, and then demand your silence when you finally stop playing along. Boundaries aren't cruelty, they're self-respect. Consequences aren't revenge, they're education. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after hearing this, it's this. Don't confuse kindness with permission. Don't confuse silence with weakness. And never build your confidence on tearing someone down in public, because the moment they stop protecting your image, the truth has a way of standing on its own. If parts of this story felt familiar, you're not alone. Many people carry these dynamics quietly for years before realizing they don't have to. If you feel comfortable, I'd love to hear your thoughts or experiences in the comments. And if stories about boundaries, accountability, and quiet strength resonate with you, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Sometimes the most powerful turning points happen without shouting. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.